Whenever the topic of dynamic campaign is brought up in DCS, whenever there is a bug in DCS, whenever someone even mentions the F-16, you can count on someone else bringing up the Falcon BMS. The story of your title, which mind you is a miracle that it even exists, yet one source code leak and 26 years of labor later, the title Falcon BMS is almost always brought up when anyone says anything even mildly frustrating about DCS. And today, I can tell you that what you get for less than €5 in Falcon BMS is more than worth your time. Because this is not just a fighter jet simulator, it is a complete simulation of war on the Korean Peninsula, and you are this one tiny fighter jet, the Fighting Falcon. So that is what I'm going to show you today. We're going to take a look at how to get into Falcon BMS legally and for the lowest price, because the €14 on Steam is not even close to the €5 you can get it by buying a different game and getting Falcon for free. It's a bit more complicated, but we'll get to it, so keep watching. Also, I'll explore the history of how the game went from this to this with pure community effort. And then I also show you how to get started and how you can contribute to the fight on the Korean Peninsula. If we're going to start somewhere, we should start here. The Fighting Falcon, probably the greatest 4th generation fighter jet ever made. Considering Viper did not have a hard time making it onto a child's bedroom wallpaper, it is no wonder that just like the Flankers, it has its own, even longer franchise of simulation games. In 1984, the first Fighting Falcon landed on the store shelves, and with the second game, Falcon, released in 1987, it became quite a success for the time and for the game studio called Spectrum Holobyte. Although not quite a success like when Spectrum Holobyte went to publish a little Soviet game called Tetris. And it gets a little complicated, but essentially behind the Spectrum Holobyte stands Gilles Louis, a venture capitalist who essentially gave birth to the Falcon series. He then went on to acquire Microprose, and thus on paper in 1993 the Spectrum Holobyte was acquired by Microprose. Louis then worked on the Falcon series until 1998. In 1998 his company was acquired by Hasbro Interactive. Microprose was one of the most revered simulation studios in history, responsible for the titles like Gunship, F-19 Stealth Fighter and F-15 Strike Eagle. The merger of Spectrum Holobyte and Microprose was meant to combine the best of both worlds. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Falcon series evolved steadily. Falcon 2, Falcon 3.0 and several mission discs built a loyal, passionate base of flight simulation enthusiasts.
Good kill!
The series continued to be developed, and by 1995 the total amount of sold copies reached 700,000, of which 400,000 were solely from Falcon 3.0. And so whatever was to come after Falcon 3.0 had to be the absolute pinnacle of combat simulation. And as often is, the development has gotten stuck in a constant loop of creating and scrapping ideas. Falcon 4.0 was supposed to be the magnum opus. The goal was unlike anything attempted in commercial gaming, a full-scale, real-time dynamic air war over the Korean Peninsula, where not just the player, but hundreds of AI aircraft, ground units, ships and command structures would fight autonomously, the war shifting and evolving whether you were at the controls or not. The simulation of the F-16 itself was to be so detailed that every switch, every avionics system, every weapon profile would be modeled to the greatest extent possible. Though originally slated for a late 1996 release, the game ended up being rushed to the market in order to make the 1998 Christmas selling season. The reviews were simultaneously glowing and horrifying. Critics recognized what Falcon 4.0 was trying to be, a simulator of breathtaking scope and ambition, while acknowledging that the actual product was plagued with crashes, bugs and a learning curve that was not so much steep as vertical. Commercially though, it was not a disaster. In the United States, Falcon 4.0 sold 41,000 copies during 1998, after its December release, accounting for $1.85 million in revenue. The community that bought it was vocal, devoted and hungry for patches. Microprose released several official patches, partially stabilizing the game, but the corporate world was about to deliver the killing blow. So after Microprose was purchased by Hasbro, as mentioned previously in 1998, official development ended. The studio that had poured years of work into this simulation was shuttered. The development team, scattered, and Falcon 4.0, still broken, still unfinished, still containing one of the most technically impressive dynamic campaign engines ever, was left for dead. But what I'm about to tell you now is a story of the greatest hairpin turn in video gaming history. Not even Richard Burns Rally can compete with this handbrake turn, because the story of Falcon BMS is at its roots the story of one of the most consequential leaks in gaming history. 9th of April 2000. One of the developers of the Falcon leaked the source code of Falcon 4.0. So, the Falcon 4.0 was now calling for the community. And to be honest, this was more of a chaotic Skype group call if anything. People formed separate communities, each developing the game in a different direction, leading to utter chaos. And then Falcon series went dark. Many thought it was abandoned, but well, there were some heroes in the dark getting some real work done. One of the dev teams that stuck around was the BMS benchmark Sims, and these guys decided to continue to work on the Falcon. 8 years in complete silence. Have they worked? With no funding, it seemed impossible to topple the rising standards of DCS, which was slowly emerging during this time. But in 2011, they were ready to drop a bomb of enriched Falconium. DCS World was still in its baby years, released in 2008, but enjoying the monopoly until one day, boom, Falcon BMS. Before I say what that exactly included, let me just say that some other Falcon mods have either immediately ceased development or straight up joined BMS. There was no competition. After 8 years of silent development, the team presented a changelog exceeding 1,500 pages, featuring a complete DirectX 9 conversion, new terrain engine, advanced flight modeling, reworked avionics, countless other improvements that left the community stunned. 1,500 pages of changelog, let that sink in. The reaction across flight sim forums was almost disbelieving. Veterans who had played Falcon 4.0 since 1998 loaded up BMS 4.32 and found something that was barely recognizable, yet unmistakably deeply Falcon. The bones of the original 1998 game were still there, the dynamic campaign engine, the Korean theater, fundamental F-16 system logic, but wrapped around these bones was something genuinely modern. All I can say that DCS can consider itself lucky they did not have an F-16 around back then. VR support, new theaters, and even eventually long-awaited F-15C, all that good stuff for free. One tiny issue still remained though, and the threat of all this falling to the ground under constantly changing publishers. Well, we don't always get a fairy tale ending, but get this. In April 2023, a bombshell dropped. An announcement on the GOG forums indicated that Falcon Collection would be delisted from GOG's catalog on Thursday, April 27, due to a change in licensing rights. The Falcon BMS community naturally reacted with some concern. The answer came quickly. Microprose proudly announced that they had reacquired the copyright to the Falcon series games. In their own statement, Falcon has officially returned to our lineup. The rebooted Microprose, a new company sharing the legendary old name, founded in 2020 and focused on reviving classic military games, had purchased the Falcon IP and brought the franchise home. And that is the story of Falcon BMS today. You would not even suspect this game is from 1998. It has been so heavily reworked that side by side you just gotta hand it to the benchmark Sims. They made greatness. Now that I got you all riled up, let me tell you how to get Falcon BMS so you don't go around and buy it on a Steam. Trust me, you can save yourself a few cups of coffee. The somewhat weird thing is that, as I mentioned, the Falcon 4.0, which you need official license for to play BMS, is not on GOG and only is on Steam. And Microprose did raise the price to €14 after sensing that thanks to BMS, there are some smeckles to be made. Well, you can still get Falcon 4.0 on GOG, because there is this Falcon Gold. It is a gold edition of Falcon 3.0. But for whatever reason in the extras of the game, which means not the files in the install option that installs your Falcon 3.0, which you obviously get too, but in the extras in a hidden folder, a file called Falcon 4.0, you want to download this and voila, you got yourself a Falcon 4.0 for under €5 on a discount like me, or €7 for normal price. The discounts are common on GOG, but the €2 is not worth the wait, in my opinion. Then all you gotta do is install Falcon BMS from the Benchmark Sims site. I will link that in the description, and yeah, you're fully set to play Falcon BMS. That was our 47th gear top tip. Now let us dive into the world of Falcon BMS and its latest version, one of, if not the greatest, 4th gen fighter jets. I highly recommend to follow one of the tutorials to bind your controls similar to the real thing. It really makes the F-16 work like a well-oiled machine, it is. And also don't forget to use the alternative launcher, since any control changes in a game will not work, which is somewhat inconvenient, especially since rebinding buttons means restarting the entire game. So it is time to get comfortable in the pretty nice F-16 cockpit. The most important stuff you need to get immediately off the ground and into fight is the HUD, the RVR and the 2 MFDs if you choose to start with your engines on the taxiway. So here is the deal to become quickly proficient in your Falcon. First, there are 2 modes you can switch into any time, and they will override all that you're doing in the air, and they will switch either to air-to-air BVR mode and air-to-air close range mode. You enter them with a single button press, and if you then exit them, whatever was on your MFDs and HUD before will be restored, which is pretty useful. So in general, if you find yourself in air with bad boys coming your way, you want to always keep an eye on your RVR. It tells you what is around you by using antennas positioned around the aircraft. Beware of some blind spots, but more importantly, what enters the inner circle is officially in the danger zone.
And this chicken here, it's 64 degrees, it's in the danger zone.
And can harm you, so you want to keep a close eye on the inner and outer circle. If you see incoming threat, the RVR will also tell you what exactly the threat is. Point yourself in the direction of the incoming threat, assuming you have the weapons to deal with such threat, and engage in BVR mode. You can then detect targets using your radar, which will be in the RVR mode, but let's not get into different radar modes. And you can most importantly lock it up, which will warn the enemy in this case. Once you lock them up, the enemy will appear on your HUD. And also you'll get range information. On the top right corner of your MFD, you see the closing speed to the enemy. You can also employ jammer, assuming you have one, by pressing DMS down, which will activate the jammer, which will then start jamming if the enemy tries to lock you up. Also, now you may drop your tanks with this big yellow button. You need to hold it for a second. Once you fire your MRAM, which is the only weapon you're likely to have for BVR, you want to deal with the missile your North Korean adversary sent in return. There are many maneuvers you may apply, but in general you want to starve the enemy missile of energy. And so, due to air being much denser closer to the ground, you would want to lower your altitude while dropping flares to avoid the missile, assuming you won't decide to weave, which involves turning around and changing directions to starve the missile of energy. Usually, this is where the fight ends. The North Koreans are not running as great planes, and simply put, the MRAM is a weapon to be reckoned with for something like MiG-23. But assuming you meet MiG-29, you might need to recommit to get the job done. Basically, modern air combat is these 4 steps. Fire missile, turn away, confuse missile, recommit. Then fire missile again, and it keeps going until one of you fails to confuse the missile. And while the AI in BMS is very impressive, MRAM will give the Soviet jets a run for their money. Rarely, but not impossibly, the situation might turn into a dogfight, but one general advice is that the F-16 is really good at sustained turn rate, at about 440 knots. Then turn on the close range air-to-air mode. And don't forget, you got helmet-mounted display, so use it. Uncage the sidewinder and send it. Hopefully it will know where it is, because it will know where it isn't and it will hit the target. Now, one quick tip: to engage with your helmet mounted display, you need to change the missile mode to bore. Now, you can do this through your right MFD, but the easiest and fastest way is to hold the cursor enable button. As long as you're holding it, the seeker of the Sidewinder will look for targets where you physically look with your own head. So make sure your missile is uncaged and then you can launch. Once you release the cursor enable button, the bore mode will be disabled. This is just a much faster way than doing it manually through the MFD buttons. Now, if you get approached from your 6 o'clock, drop the 440 knot rule and instead just turn in as hard as you can. Remember, as one German said, always fly to meet the enemy. Since the F-16 is a true multi-role fighter jet, you can perform a variety of missions. All the BVR dogfighting and the suppression of enemy air defenses you can now put to good use to fight in a war. And when I mean war, I mean war. Falcon BMS has probably the most comprehensive dynamic campaign of all games. Like all of them, it's just a bit unreal. Best I show you. So to show you how to do some air to ground, we're going to create ourselves a simple mission in the first campaign of this game. So we're going to bomb this airfield to oblivion to make sure the enemies cannot use it, which is a very useful way how to slowly chip away from the enemy air defenses. Do a so-called click dance to get the comms loaded into the jet itself. I recommend to fly as not the lead, because the flight lead handles all the comms and you're just a regular Jeff. So let us join the war. So I have decided to go with a little bit of a cheeky loadout, since we're carrying 4 MRAMs just in case, and 4 large bombs, Mark 84s, and 1 fuel tank, which is a little bit less on fuel, but I'm not expecting all that much trouble, which may not have been the best decision. On our way to the target, I configure my bombs and I prepare for a swift destruction of the enemy runway. And well then, something silly happens. About 7 billion MiGs appear from the sky. So, unfortunately, instead of just doing the bombing run that I wanted to show you, I just pretty much had to fight those MiGs. Luckily, there were some friendly F-16s around which helped me to fight them off, but it did mean that I have to jettison my tanks, and thus, the mission was a failure. On the other hand, we did take out some MiGs. This is Falcon BMS. It's not DCS, you cannot predict what's going to happen, and sometimes you just gotta drop the bombs, even if you are not on target. But that, at the end of the day, is what makes BMS, BMS. Because you just cannot simply predict what's going to happen. But at the same time, we are returning home with some kills, so it's at least not a complete waste of time, but you can see that it is always worth it to take at least a little bit of air-to-air missiles with you, just in case some bad boys appear. War, they say, never changes, and if we were to believe this lie, we would drive into the battle with a cave mobile. But instead, we got the fully loaded 4th generation fighter jet. Falcon BMS offers the most advanced real-time modeling of a modern battlefield in air combat simulation. The base game comes with the Korean theaters, so that is going to be our focus in this video, but other official theaters include the likes of Israel, Balkans, and more. You can choose between multiple scenarios involving escalation of the Korean conflict between North and South, or you can play a scenario where Russia invades South Korea, which brings in the challenge of more advanced Russian fighter jets. Also available are scenarios where China gets involved. If I had to take a guess, there is at least 100 hours of unique gameplay to be played, but even more so if you consider the replayability, which thanks to the comprehensive nature of the missions generated and F-16 multi-role capabilities is really high, not even counting other flyable planes, and that is just one theater of many. This is obviously just a small portion of what BMS offers, but these small operations do add up, and at the end of the day, if you do well, you complete your mission successfully, you will win the conflict. Some campaigns are time dependent, like trying to take over Pyongyang before the peace talks begin, to secure better bargaining chips. Overall, you're just one fighter pilot in a full-scale war. Everything is simulated, even outside of your jet. If you have to eject, you better hope someone called it in, so you can be rescued. Enemy places down SAM sites where they expect you to strike, and much more. Now, Falcon BMS is not without its shortcomings. The most obvious one is of course the graphics, which as the series developed have improved significantly, but compared to the likes of DCS, it is a tough sell for those wanting cinematic experience, especially in VR. On the other hand, Falcon BMS is much easier to run on lower spec computers, and that is true especially for VR. One other shortcoming is the lack of variety outside of dynamic campaign. Falcon BMS begins and ends with the dynamic campaign. Outside of it, your options are limited, and pre-made missions are not very popular, nor do they offer much more than the dynamic campaign itself. So basically, once you get tired of the mission set in dynamic campaign, that is pretty much it. Now, considering this is a very long-going community, people will strongly defend Falcon BMS at every turn. But the replayability is not as infinite as many people will claim it is. It is very good, but not infinite. And now I'm about to say something a little bit silly. So if you're a long-standing fan of the Falcon BMS community, I would highly recommend not perhaps even watching this part of the video and skip to the next chapter. What I talked about just sort of highlights one extra issue, and that is community elitism. I like to call this the RBR syndrome, where it is somewhat interesting how both these games, despite being completely different, share the same community tropes like elitism, read the ducking manualism, and DCS bad ism. I personally have a theory that a lot of these people in these games at some point make the game part of their life, part of their own personality, and thus, if someone criticizes the game, that also criticizes through process of pure delusion the elite player base itself. Thus some levels of toxicity may arise. Obviously these individuals are a minority in the community, so in no way am I criticizing the whole community, but unfortunately these people are often the loudest. Now let's get back to the good stuff, and since I already mentioned VR, let us go virtual. When it comes to VR in Falcon BMS, I have to say I did not expect it to run so well. Since the BMS itself is a lot less demanding than other simulations, it does run exceptionally well. I ran my Quest 2 with fully maxed resolution and I was able to maintain the same graphic settings that I used with my monitor and Track AR, all the while hitting somewhat stable 90 frames per second. There were a few dips here and there, but otherwise it runs really well. You can see how the performance progressed over the years, since the older the post about VR on the BMS forum, the worse the performance. And right now on my 4070 Ti Super, I did not have any trouble whatsoever running it. Also, Alt+V will get the visor down, which will help you see the HUD better, which in VR becomes really hard to read without the visor. It appears you can choose by pressing Alt-C and C again to either click where you are looking or use the other mode where your mouse snaps onto the buttons in your cockpit. I was able to even later tweak the footage in OBS to look decent. Overall the experience is really solid, except spotting missile, that is considerably harder in VR. One extra 47th gear top tip: it is probably a good idea to use your VR headset via cable rather than the Airlink, since my Quest 2 for example lasted only about 45 minutes, going from 80% of battery to 30, which considering the length of some flight missions may not be enough, and the cable can definitely prolong this. And that is sort of it. It was a relatively long video since BMS has a lot to offer and I did not look at the F-16 or the Balkan Theater, so maybe we could check that out later. But like I said, this is one of the most comprehensive simulations, if not straight up the best, if we also account for the dynamic campaign of the F-16, Fighting Falcon. The series has had many ups and downs, but Benchmark Sims truly created a masterpiece here. For 5 or 7 euros, it is more than worth your time, and it definitely gets a recommendation from 47th gear. Just like the L2 1946, also an older game that you might want to check out if you're willing to trade a bit of quality for quantity. Check out our SU47 Discord, fly the SU47, leave a like and maybe even subscribe. And have a better than usual day. Goodbye.